Welcome again. Yesterday we continued our conversation about the relationships between husbands and wives. As I pointed out, there's no more central key relationship in your life. If you're really going to learn how to live the Christian life in an in-depth sort of way, as a character transforming and defining kind of way, it's going to come through marriage relationships. And I say that with a little bit of caution because I know that there are many out there who are living as a consequence of a broken relationship. A husband or wife has left your life, has gotten rid of you, kind of thrown you under the bus, or maybe you were the guilty party in that regard, because I think that a lot of us did a lot of things before we were saved that we deeply regret. But also it comes through things like widowhood or becoming a widower. You lose your husband or spouse through death, and there's a huge void that's left there in your life, and there should be. Even if your relationship was broken through divorce, there is a vacuum there because there is a bonding that comes as a consequence. We'll get into that probably more in depth tomorrow about the idea of being one flesh. But what I really want to focus on again is continuing that conversation about the kind of love that we are supposed to have in the intimate relationship of marriage. And keep in mind, I talked about it yesterday, there are the 4 kinds of love. If you really want to go an in-depth study, C.S. Lewis has a wonderful book called The 4 Loves. I love to read anything written by C.S. I love and I read. He's really one of my written mentors, if you will, in life. But he talks about the 4 kinds of love. We talked about the eros love, the storge love, the phileo love. But the one that is really most often featured in the New Testament, not exclusively, but most often featured, is what is often referred to as agape. The word that Paul uses, the verb tense, is agapao. And it's interesting. There are really kind of 4 qualities to agapao love, or the agape love. The first one is appreciation, as opposed to contemptuousness. And I've talked about contempt quite a bit, and I do that intentionally because I think most often when I'm meeting with couples, I find that this is really the central issue. At some point or another, they've given themselves permission not to love, to show affection, or not to show respect for the other person because they've done something or they have certain characteristics they find so unattractive. Let me tell you the truth here. The more you get to know anybody, you're going to find those unattractive aspects in their life. And so if you're going to have any relationship with anybody at all, you're going to have to learn to really overlook or forgive and be forbearing and patient with people and their certain characteristics. See, all of us were born to sinful parents, and we were born into a sinful world, and we ourselves are sinners. And sin has this way of damaging the soul. It creates certain dysfunctional characteristics in our personality. And there are things that we pick up in an effort to navigate, negotiate life. And it's kind of interesting. For every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. And so every one of us who has been wounded or hurt in life tends to react to the opposite extreme, and we pick up a lot of crazy characteristics. It can be everything from boasting to judgmentalism or criticism or envy or hatred. The list goes on and on. But all those negatives are really responses, reactions to something that was done to us. And one of the sad things that many of us don't want to admit, that every one of us has been victimized, and as a consequence, we learn to cope by becoming a victimizer. And so part of the repentance process of my life is seeing where I've developed bad behavior traits, and I've used them as a way of navigating life. I take, for example, husbands who become very angry, or wives who rage at their husbands in anger. Anger is this strong emotion, but it grows out of fear and depression. And so what we're really doing in our anger is pushing away something that we see as threatening to us. And usually that threatening thing is something we feel that's going to depreciate our worth or value, or make us feel worse about ourselves than we already do. And so that's why it's so important to realize when Paul says earlier, be angry but don't sin, that we can be angry at certain things. In fact, there are some things I think we should be angry about. I mean, I have a kind of a resident anger about the idea of abortion. I'm not angry at the people who do it. I'm angry at the people who perform the abortions and who try to justify it. And yet I have to step back and say, God, you love them, and I need to continue to love them, even though I have, I think, a righteous anger towards something like abortion. So, these are kind of emotional dynamics that become very conflicting for us as Christians, because we read the word and then we try to figure out, okay, how does that apply to my life in a practical way? And usually we overreact or we over-apply, and we become really kind of odd and sometimes very critical and judgmental. But what we have to understand is that the defining characteristic of God that stands out most prominently, John says in his first letter, God is love. He's agapao. He's agape. That's who he is. And when he looks at you through the lens of love. Now, that doesn't mean that he doesn't have a righteousness to him, that he isn't a just God. And it certainly doesn't imply he won't hold you accountable for bad behavior. As a matter of fact, any loving parent is going to hold their kids accountable for bad behavior. Those who ignore it or blink at or wink at it are only solidifying destructive patterns and behaviors in their children's lives that will basically one day those kids will hate you for not dealing with those things in them that you should have addressed. But saying all of that, when we talk about God, it is quite fair to begin by saying that his primary view of mankind is love, and even his judgment is an expression of that love, because he's seeking to get us justified. The idea of being justified is things balance out. When you're adding up columns of figures and accounting, you have to have a justification at the end. It has to be basically, they need to equal each other and become balanced out. And God is seeking to bring our lives into a holy and godly balance. And so even his justice is an effort to bring that kind of balance, and more specifically, the shalom that the Jews speak of, which doesn't mean just peace, but it means that you are in peace because your life is in harmony with God. So any area of my life where I have disharmony is an evidence that I'm out of harmony with God. And I need to pray and seek and confess whatever that might be. So the love of God is always trying to bring us back into that peaceful, harmonious relationship with God, our Maker. And sometimes he has to discipline us in order to make that happen. But again, so what does this word agape or agapao really mean? I mean, how do we understand its application? Well, first and foremost, we understand that, as I said, it's an appreciation of the other person. That I recognize that they play a valuable and important part in my life. And here again, that if we become irritated with our spouse, what we're drawing is a conclusion that if they weren't in my life would be better. And I think that's the first stumbling block that we have in relationships, because every person is going to add complexity and challenges and difficulties to our lives. In many ways, it's simpler to live by yourself. It's simpler not to have kids, but it also becomes increasingly and intensely lonely as time goes on. And so we appreciate the fact that there is somebody who is willing to share this journey with me, even though we have to learn how to adjust ourselves to one another in order to do that effectively, that it stops being a competitiveness where I'm trying to convince them to do things my way, but it's a willingness to really adapt myself in critical areas, that my strength might be a blessing to them, and my weakness will also be something that they'll carry, that they're willing to bless me with. Because I find in most relationships, if not all relationships, we're not identical. Just because we're men and women makes us vastly different persons. But the simple fact is, my wife has strengths that I do not have, and I have strengths that she does not have. And so it really means, appreciation means there's a complementary relationship, that we see ourselves as a team, not as individuals. Now, this is really hard to grasp in our culture and our time, because increasingly people are living lives that are separated and isolated. In other words, we go to work at different places and spend most of our creative and and money-making energy not working with that other person and sharing with them in the process, but rather doing it separately. And oftentimes the wife, if she can stay home, is with the kids all day, the husband's with his employers. It's so much easier to go to work, people have told me, than it is to come home and deal with the family. And so as a consequence, we begin to not see the complementary relationship. We see how that we feel like we're better in some context because the other person isn't there. Well, these are critical issues, and I think that we have to begin by realizing that we're meant to have these reciprocal relationships where we complement each other, and that means that we have to spend time with one another. And I'll talk more about this when we get into the parenting issue, but when people say I have quality time and not quantity time, I think that's just a false truism, if you will, because the reality is that the only way you develop quality in anything is by spending time. Time is the investment. In other words, if I'm going to have surgery, I don't want a guy who says, well, I really went to a good school and got a quality education, but I've never actually done this before. No, I want the guy with a quality education, but also who has years of experience. How many times have you done this? And what has been the outcome? How successful you have been? And that just comes from investment of time. And so one of the things I think that we have to understand is you can only learn to appreciate the other person by doing life with them in a practical, real way, so that you look at ways to share life. So, I found that when I got married, I had all sorts of interests. I was a skier, I was a golfer, I used to do a lot of things, loved to play tennis. And my wife couldn't check any of those boxes. She didn't enjoy any of those things. I drug her up on the ski hill. She froze her buns off. And eventually, when the kids were gone, she says, I don't find this fun. You can go by yourself. And I waited out and I thought, when I'm spending 8 hours on a golf course, when I'm spending 12 hours up on a mountain skiing, that's time that I'm not spending with my wife. And I have to make a decision. And I chose to invest my time with my wife. I chose to do things that she liked. And a lot of it was stuff I had to learn to develop an appreciation for. But the whole point was that I was simply realizing that I appreciate the dynamic that exists between us, and I'm willing to invest in that, even if it means I have to give certain things up. So I've gone on quite a bit about this, but again, we're still talking about what is this agape love, and we'll pick that up tomorrow as we look further. God bless you. Go in His grace.